Hey, Immigrantly family, it's Saadia, and I want to share something that I think is genuinely exciting. The Wilczek Foundation is accepting applications for their Wilczek prizes for creative promise in culinary arts in two categories: food and beverage, and media and storytelling. And guess what? They are specifically looking for immigrants doing this work. Here's who they are looking for. You have to have been born outside the US to non American parents, be 38 or younger, and have at least 5 years of professional experience. It could be chefs, artisans, food makers, for media and storytelling, writers, academics, content creators, even podcasters. 6 prize winners will each receive a $50,000 cash award. The deadline is May 4th. Learn more and apply now at wilczek.org. That's vilcek.org. Your story deserves to be recognized.
With Plan B emergency contraception, we're in control of our future. It's backup birth control you take after unprotected sex that helps prevent pregnancy before it starts. It works by temporarily delaying ovulation, and it won't impact your future fertility. Plan B is available in all 50 U.S. states at all major retailers near you, with no ID, prescription, or age requirement needed. Together, we've got this. Follow Plan B on Insta at Plan B One Step to learn more. Use as directed.
Hello and welcome to Immigrantly. I am your host, Saadia Khan. For the longest time, I debated whether or not to tell people I was Muslim, not because I was embarrassed of my faith, but because I was tired of answering the follow-up questions. Tired of watching how people's faces shifted, the awkward silence that followed. So I left that part of my identity at the door. But guess what I realized? I had started negotiating convenience for authenticity. And every time I did that, I lost a little piece of who I was. So today's episode hits close to home because we are going to talk about Muslim identity. And here is my sincere request. If you're not Muslim or have never met a Muslim, come with an open heart and an open mind. Listen along. I hope you will learn something not just about Islam, but about what it means to carry an identity that the world has very strong opinions about before you even open your mouth. And I want to start with something that I think about a lot, because part of what makes it so exhausting to carry this identity, part of why I used to leave it at the door, is this persistent idea that Muslim and aggressive are somehow synonymous, that Islam and violence go hand in hand, that Muslim countries are uniquely dangerous on the world stage. So let's actually look at the data, because I did the research and the numbers, they tell a very different story. In the last 100 years, roughly 10 to 12 Muslim-majority countries have launched military operations that could be called an invasion of another sovereign state. 10 to 12 out of 53. That means the vast majority of Muslim-majority countries have never invaded anyone. Now let's look at the other side of that ledger. Non-Muslim countries. We are talking about 30 to 40 or more nations, with the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, and France alone accounting for well over 100 distinct military operations. And here's the part that really stopped me in my tracks. Almost every Muslim country on the planet was conquered and colonized by Europeans or Russians. Most of them only gained independence after World War II. Many of the conflicts we see in the Muslim majority countries today, the borders that don't make sense, the ethnic tensions, the political instability, those are in large part the inheritance of colonial powers who drew lines on maps without any regard for the people living there. So when someone looks at me and their face shifts, when there is that awkward silence after I say I'm Muslim, I want them to understand what that silence is built on. It is not built on facts, it's built on a narrative. A narrative that has been repeated so many times, it started to feel like truth. And the irony is, people who've suffered most from conflict in the Muslim world are Muslims themselves. The vast majority of victims of violence in Muslim majority countries are Muslims. And let me be clear on something else. This is not a clash of civilizations. This is what happens when you combine the legacy of colonialism, the interference of major world powers, and decades of political instability, and then conveniently blame the religion of the people caught in the middle. I'm not saying Muslim majority governments have always been innocent. They've not. Those things happened and they matter. But they are not uniquely Muslim failures. They are human failures, the same failures that gave us World War One, World War Two, Vietnam, and the ongoing invasion of Ukraine and a genocide in Gaza. What I am trying to say here is the story you've been told about Muslim aggression is incomplete at best and dishonest at worst. And when you walk around with an incomplete story about an entire group of people, you end up creating a world where someone like me has to decide every single day whether it is safe to tell you who I am. I hope that ends today, at least on this show. And now to my today's guest. My guest is Salman Khan, a journalist, composer, producer with roots in Lahore, raised in Doha, and now traveling between Doha and New York. He knows this tension intimately because he's spent his career building a body of work that refuses to let Muslim identity stay hidden or simplified. As an executive producer of More Muslim, he's created a narrative podcast that goes deep into the Muslim experience with all of its messiness and contradictions. So without further ado, let's jump right in. How are you doing, Salman?
I am doing very well.
How's Doha?
Doha is interesting. It's an interesting time to be in Doha right now.
So people have a lot of thoughts, stories. I'm sure when you're not living in that place and you watch the news, it's scary. But you're there. How are things?
I don't know how long has it been since the ceasefire went into effect, so it's been relatively calm since then. But I think in the first few days, it was pretty nerve-wracking because you were I think I kind of live near both a desalination plant and oil fields. I think Doha is just generally really small, so it's kind of very much like anything happening anywhere in the country, everyone is kind of impacted by it. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think we kind of got a little bit of a test run last year when the first time Iran retaliated and then there were strikes. That was the first time I had ever seen anything like it. I saw like explosions in the sky and it looked like it was kind of happening. You were in a scene from a movie. But honestly, I think for a lot of us here, we've just been thinking a lot about what people in Gaza have been going through for years now. And I think that's what's keeping everything in perspective because I don't really know that many people here who are like freaking out that much just because they're like, who are we to freak out? And I think it's just the kind of thing where we've all been following the news for so long that it's not a surprise that something like this happens closer to home. It's just something that we're, alhamdulillah, we're all like relatively safe here. There's a built-in protection mechanism that has been activated. And I mean, most of the sounds you're hearing were mostly off like missiles being intercepted rather than those being struck. But there were a couple that were also struck here. So it's been an interesting time.
And there's this perception of, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Qatar, they are very safe. And I think, unfortunately, that's been shattered in a way. It seems like no place is safe anymore. And that's a scary thought to have. Going back to what you said about Gaza, so much has happened in Gaza, a genocide unfolding. Who are we to complain? Do you think that's unfair, though?
I don't know. It's honestly been a really weird situation to be in, because I remember even last year when the Iran first retaliated, it wasn't that people here were like upset at Iran. Like most people were upset at the US and upset at Israel.
In fact, I feel like Iran has gained some goodwill around the world. Like people are seeing Iran in a different light. Do you see that?
I'm only kind of seeing from the perspective on the ground here in Doha, and I think even here, like it's a bit conflicted now, especially since these strikes have been going on for weeks now. Like I think when the U.S. and Israel targeted a university there, we work off of university campuses here, so there are a lot of American university campuses. So like our show is kind of based in the area where the university campuses are held as well, and we all had to evacuate our offices because there was a threat on all American university campuses in Qatar. So I think now people are very much more conflicted the longer the war goes on. But I think in general, just everybody just wants it to end as soon as possible.
Absolutely. I mean, who wants war? And I feel like somebody who's worked in human rights advocacy and human rights space, the whole idea of rules based world order is disintegrating right before our eyes. Like there is no respect for sovereign nations. There is no respect for human life and human dignity. As you said, everything is now up for grabs. It's like, oh, you can attack a university and you can attack a civilian building and it's okay. And that's what I think started with Gaza. I think Israel's genocide of Gaza has basically unraveled or unleashed this monster, which I don't think anybody can undo now.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's always been an open question of how much of the world order there was there in the first place.
I thought
And I
there
think
was. I was optimistic, Salman. I really did believe that there was.
I mean, I'm from Pakistan. I've seen all kinds of things. Like
Look, I grew up in
oh yeah,
Pakistan
that's
too,
true.
but I've lived in the US long enough. And then I used to work a lot with UN women and other UN entities. And there was always this feeling of, we can make world a better place.
Yeah, I guess there was an optimism.
Yeah, optimism and I guess savior mentality that's ingrained in you when you've lived long enough in the US. But at the same time, I don't know. I really believed in international law. I still do. So it's so disappointing to see all that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think international law is also such a, like, I feel like I've always wanted to do more work on international law. I used to work on a show about the US Supreme Court when I was at WNYC. And we were always talking about doing like an international version of the show because we would always be covering Supreme Court stories. And I think it was always so interesting to see kind of like what is the Supreme Court of the world? Like, does the US have to be the Supreme Court of the world? I think one of my colleagues did an episode about that a few years back. I'm not a legal expert by any means. There is a, like, I guess a seal of optimism or like optimistic thinking that's been broken in general around the world. It's just an open question on whether you can come back from that or come back to a world of believing that there can be a better place. But I mean, I think we just kind of have to keep doing our work of trying to tell stories.
A KFC tale in the pursuit of flavor. The Colonel made his $10 Tuesday bucket so full with 8 pieces of juicy, crispy chicken or tenders that it might just last you till Wednesday. If you've got that kind of self-control. I mean, some people want leftovers. Others are more into right nowers. The Colonel lived so we could chicken. $10, 8 pieces, one big deal with KFC $10 Tuesdays.
Prices and participation may vary. Taxes, tips, and fees extra.
Talking about stories, More Muslim, what caught my attention was the name, More Muslim. So it's not called Islamic Voices, Muslim Stories. More seems like such a deliberate choice. Are you trying to say that there isn't enough that exists around Muslim narrative, Muslim stories, and we need more of it?
I've been asked this question a few different times, and every single person comes up with their own meaning of what they think the show means. And so I kind of like to keep it a bit more vague, because I feel like there's just so many meanings that you can kind of look into it with the show. Because I think growing up in either Muslim countries or Muslim communities, you often also hear like, who is more Muslim than each other? Like, am I like, you need to be more Muslim? Or there's also this element of like, we need more Muslim stories. We need more Muslim narratives out there. There's also a lot of different, I guess, I don't want to put an official meaning to what the name is supposed to be, but I'm curious what you think of it.
Let me rephrase the question. Where did that feeling come from personally for you?
So the show was started by me and Suhaira Siddiqui, who is a professor at Georgetown and the director of Al Mujadala Center and Mosque for Women in Qatar. She was my first Islamic theology teacher in university. So when I was in Georgetown in Qatar, I was honestly afraid of theology classes at that time because Georgetown had this requirement that every student had to do 2 classes of theology because it's a Jesuit university and you get to choose kind of which theology class.
Ah, interesting.
And I think for me, it was always an interesting challenge because there were so many questions that I had, but at the same time, so many debates I tried to avoid throughout my childhood because I just was not a very confrontational person. And so I remember like it's oftentimes when you were kind of discussing issues in Islamic law or Islamic theology or just within the Muslim community in general, growing up in like the 2000s, I think you're either like defending Islam or you're attacking, but there wasn't really a space for like Muslims to be having these kinds of conversations with each other. And I remember the first time I took that Intro to Islamic Law class with Professor Siddiqui, I remember it was just such a like eye-opening experience because I think it was the first time in my life where like I had the space to like openly discuss those like really nitty-gritty topics of like really diving into the philosophy, the theology, the history, the real legal machinations around like different decisions that were made. And Dr. Sierra was she just had such a natural talent at making the classroom like such an open space of discussion and discovery that like oftentimes like I think as students we would go into classes not knowing where we fell on certain questions or where we fell on. And I think the way she would kind of structure those classes was she would kind of take you through like how like jurists would kind of approach these questions as these like really methodical legal scholars. And I think that was such an eye-opening and wonderful experience that I just like started like following her wherever she went. Like I signed up for whatever classes I could when she was in university. And then after I graduated, the two of us kind of became friends and she would kind of host these gatherings of like student graduates of those classes that were there. I remember in one of those classes, we were like at the same time, like I was also really getting this real affinity for narrative audio. I had been listening for like almost a decade at that point. And it was just, there was something so special about like narrative audio stories like This American Life, like Throughline, like all the NPR shows, all the WNYC shows, all the Gimlet shows that were starting off at that point. And I remember thinking like listening to a lot of those shows, Dr. Sarah was also a big fan of those. And she and I would always talk about like, it would be really good to like, take the stuff that was happening in that classroom and see how can we like bring it to this like bigger audience. Like I feel like these are a lot of questions that we should be having more broadly as a community, but most of the spaces were often mediated by like external voices. So if you wanted to do a show, you would kind of have to fit under the This American Life format or the Throughline format or a lot of the formats that are out there. And again, I love all of those shows, but I think it was just really hard to imagine like why a show like that might be interested in one of our stories. And so at that point, like I hadn't even gone into journalism. So it was just kind of like a fanciful thing of like, there should be some kind of thing that we should do. And eventually we kind of started getting serious about it. And we worked on a couple of pilots. I eventually then moved to journalism full time. I moved to New York. Then I worked at places like WNYC. Like I worked on the kinds of shows that I was trying to model it off of. And the same time, we had kept working on this project on the side. So I was kind of developing this alongside my work there. And I had these pilots that we had worked on before. And I think at some point, she got a job offer to kind of run this new center in Qatar. And this was the first time where she was kind of responsible for the full budget of the thing. And she was like, look, we have this mission of public outreach as well. What do you think about like coming back and like us doing more Muslim together again? And we do it properly with a proper budget and we try to get a team together. And that time, like, honestly, at that time, I'd been working in journalism for a while. I had like met so many wonderful people, learned so many things that it was actually a much better time. I'm glad we didn't get kicked off right when we did, because by the time I came back and we started working on the show together properly, I'd actually learned a lot more about journalism, a lot more about narrative audio. And so I was much more qualified to actually run the show than I would have if we just started off back then.
I was reading somewhere that this started as a capstone project for you. And the first 2 episodes, one was about Rumi and the other one was about meat industry. That did not make its way into more Muslim podcasts that I saw on Apple. Was that a deliberate choice? Why did you decide not to share those stories?
I think that's a good question. Those stories were the pilots of the show that we had started off. So they're still available on my website. I haven't removed them. We were still trying to figure out what the voice of the show is supposed to be and what the style of the show is supposed to be. And at that time, we were kind of co-hosting the project. So she and I were doing it together. Those stories were really interesting. One was a story about Rumi, which was about how Rumi became one of the most famous poets in the West and one of the most best-selling poets in the West, but his entire like essence of his Muslim identity was kind of eradicated. So he kind of became this like white hippie mystic monk figure.
Yeah.
Not in anywhere in space or time. He's just like kind of exists. The quotes that would float around were like generic enough that everyone would kind of like, they would like snap their fingers listening to it, but they would never really get the context behind it. And so we kind of did this project where we talked to all these people. And that was actually the first episode of More Muslim. That was the pilot episode that we did. And that one I developed when I was in grad school at the City University of New York at the J School with a professor there. I did it as part of an independent study with this professor from NPR's Planet Money, Amanda Aronchik. And I basically pitched her to be my editor for that story. And I was like, look, I know this is a good idea, but I need to learn how to like make this really like a compelling story. And so she like very much taught me the basics of like how to structure narrative stories together. And like that project ended up taking like 5-6 months to produce just that one pilot. But I think it was such a good learning experience that I then did another one on the halal meat industry. And it was just a question of like, I had moved to the US and I was just used to eating halal everywhere when I was in Qatar, because growing up in a Muslim country, you're not really looking for halal. But then in the US, I would go everywhere. You'd see these like little green halal stickers. And I was just very suspicious of those stickers because I was like, who is actually regulating this industry here? Like, because I know the US, there's church state, you're not really regulating. So I was wondering like, who is actually regulating the halal meat industry in the US and how did it even evolve to the point where like, walking in a random supermarket in Astoria, I could find like halal meat in just the meat section, right? And I think so we did that story. I went to a slaughterhouse in Virginia. I would talk to a bunch of people, talk to these halal meat, like this like white woman in Michigan who was doing her PhD about halal meat certification.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm hoping actually like once the season is over, we might release those episodes.
You should. Hey, Immigrantly family. The Wilczek Foundation is accepting applications for the Wilczek Prizes for Creative Promise in Culinary Arts in two categories: food and beverage, and media and storytelling. They are looking for immigrants doing this work. If you were born outside the US to non American parents, are 38 years old or younger, and have at least 5 years of professional experience in either category, start your application for their $50,000 cash award by May 4th. Your story deserves to be recognized. More Muslim. It is Muslim experience with all its messiness, but it centers on women mostly. There are stories about women being locked out of mosques, women translating Sahih International Quran, and then nikah making Muslim women invisible. So, why did you guys decide to center more on Muslim women? And I'm also curious to know, as an executive producer, as a man, how do you sit with these stories? How do you sit within this space?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main things was that we got our funding through Mujadala, which is a center and mosque for women in Qatar, and that's the center that Dr. Sawyer is leading. And actually, that's one of the reasons that like we decided to kind of move away from the co-host model, at least for this season, which was I was like, it doesn't make sense for me to be in the as the driving voice of it. And we ended up hiring like I think for every episode I think almost entirely every episode is led by a female Muslim reporter, even on the production side. That was one of the reasons for focusing on Muslim women in the first season. And we're hoping that as this show kind of evolves and grows older, we kind of like evolve the types of topics that we're touching on as well. But I think with each of those topics, we really still wanted to not just create a space where it was outsiders kind of criticizing moments within the community. It was actually a conversation that people were having within the community with each other. So like even I think you mentioned the nikah loophole episode. I think it was such a complicated episode because it was very much like, on one hand, you were kind of talking about whether Muslims should register their nikahs in the US, right? And I think that's a question that a lot of Muslims in the US, the UK, and all these like Western countries often have is, I had my religious marriage, but my religious marriage is not recognized by the state until I go to the courthouse, until I fill out all these documents. And so there's this whole movement that happened in the UK called Register Our Marriages. And that movement was very clear, like, you guys need to register your marriages. Like, here's why, and all these things that were happening where like women were not getting their divorce settlements or women were facing all kinds of hurdles. Like, I think one of the examples was that I think someone's husband passed away and their marriage was never legally recognized. So then a lot of the paperwork that happened afterwards became really problematic, and like who owns the property and all that. And I think there was a lot of nuance within those debates that we wanted to bring out, because it wasn't just a polemic of like, this is why everyone should register their marriages, because a lot of people, a lot of women included, didn't want to register their marriages and they had their own reasons for doing so. I mean, if you listen to the episode, there's a lot of different perspectives on that. And I think for some of them, it's like, look, this is something that I don't want my state to govern my religious affairs, or I need the freedom to be able to say, like, again, it's a very complicated topic that I feel like it'll be, I wouldn't do full justice to the story. And I think this is where narrative is a really fruitful thing to have, because it's a very helpful medium through which we can kind of govern these conversations, where it's much harder for me in just a one sit down interview to tell you everything about that story.
Right.
Whereas I think in a 40-50 minute narrative episode, that's like 5 months of work and 5 months of reporting and 5 months of research and 5 months of editing, sound design, music, all of that went into it. So hopefully by the end of that whole process, you end up with a story that kind of captures the full complexity of the situation, but not in a way where it's talking. I think the thing that we really tried to emphasize with More Muslim was that we didn't want to make a show about Muslims. We wanted to make a show for Muslims. So it's not us kind of talking about this group and how we're just like you, like Americans, Pakistanis, whatever. And I think we wanted to create a show which is like, hey, these are the conversations that Muslims are having with each other, within their communities, within their spaces. And these are the conversations we should be having alongside like this broader like community of Muslims around the world. And I think we've also really tried to focus beyond just the diaspora Muslims as well. So we're doing a lot more international stories, especially in the second half of the season. So we just released an episode about South Africa's oldest Muslim community called the Cape Malay. And it's a Muslim community not like a lot of Muslims have not heard of before. And they've been around for 400 years in South Africa. Their roots were, they came in as enslaved Indonesians who were brought through by Dutch slavers, and how they kind of used zikr and they kind of maintained their like faith and used their faith as this uniting thing that helped them survive like hundreds of years of slavery, colonialism, apartheid. Those are the kinds of stories that we're trying to do over the course of this show. And hopefully, now we're working on season 2. We've got some interesting stories coming up as well that are also a bit really in the messy areas of really diving more into like Islamic legal philosophy and debates and all these things that are happening.
So when you go to those messy places, how does that change or does it affect your relationship with Islam?
I guess for me, it's a bit of a interesting case right now because most of this season, I wasn't the reporter on most of the stories. So I was mostly working as a producer and editor behind the scenes. I have noticed when you're producing, when you're reporting, especially, I think you kind of get deep into the weeds of the topic in a way that like I got really deep into the halal meat industry when I was working on the halal meat story. We're thinking of doing a story about the music is haram debate for next season.
I think those are the kinds of conversations because Muslims are divided on those conversations, right? You did not grow up in Pakistan, right?
I didn't. I grew up in Qatar.
Right. But I grew up in Pakistan. And honestly, there wasn't a moment when I was told that music is haram. I grew up listening to music. Music was such an integral part of our household. Like my parents used to listen to music, and I grew up watching Bollywood. But I feel like how Muslim identity manifests or how it's practiced, even within different cultures and ethnicities, it's so different. And that brings me to your personal relationship with religion or where you grew up. Now, Pakistan and Qatar have very different way of celebrating religion, right? The practice, the unspoken rules about what it means to be a Muslim. So, growing up in Qatar with Pakistani roots, did you ever feel you were caught between two different Muslim standards?
You know, it's actually funny because I think since your show is about immigration, I think people in Qatar occupy a very unique liminal sphere of immigration, which is not even immigration. It's just the migrant life where you're never completely sure where like I mean again this I guess there's a interesting difference between growing up as like an immigrant in a place like the US and growing up in Qatar, because in the US there's this struggle between assimilation with American culture versus maintaining the roots of your identity of like where your parents came from or where you originally came from. In Qatar, there isn't any assimilation at all. So like when you grew up in Qatar, like if your residency in Qatar is derived from like I don't even know. Like I think it's actually based on like whoever was there when the country was founded, and those are the locals. So I am not a Qatari national. I am a Pakistani. So I grew up in Qatar. I was born and raised there, but I grew up with a very clear idea that I'm from Pakistan, that my parents are from Pakistan, my grandparents are from Pakistan. Generations of my family has lived in Pakistan, India, South Asia for like the longest time. So I think growing up, for my parents, it was always very clear that like, just remember, you're Pakistani. So there wasn't that dilemma of like being caught between two cultures because my passport is Pakistani. I went to a Pakistani school here. I spoke Urdu at home. You know, there was a lot of you kind of, especially in the Gulf, South Asian communities grow up in these really unique diaspora situations where you're almost living in mini. It's not even bubbles. It's that the majority of the people around you are actually like Qatar, for example. It's 90% immigrants, right, or migrants. And so most of the people around me have always been South Asians, Egyptians, Palestinians, you know, and you often kind of live in this atmosphere where you don't recognize as much of a difference when you go back home to Pakistan, because I think for our parents there was always an active effort to make sure that the kids spoke Urdu, so that we might have to leave Qatar at any time because it's always an impermanence. And I think going back to Pakistan, it was always interesting growing up because I had a very different schooling experience in Qatar than I did when I would go to Pakistan. And meeting with my cousins, they were always also confused on whether to make fun of me as a foreigner or not. Because yeah, and I think that's the difference I've noticed.
You were not foreigner enough in some ways, right?
Yeah. Because I think it was I think we all spoke Urdu, right? So I think it was also the thing of they were always confused. I'm oh, these are, at some point, I think they yeah, I think growing up, I was kind of not the biggest fan of going to Pakistan because it was so different from Qatar. But at the same time, it still felt very similar. You were seeing all these Pakistanis who, you see Pakistanis in Qatar, you see Pakistanis in Pakistan. There is a subtle difference. But I think growing up, you kind of learn a lot more about the smaller nuances. So even to your question, in the way religion is practiced, I think it's been very interesting to meet people who have come from different places in Pakistan, who grew up in Pakistan and then came to Qatar, or who grew up in Pakistan and then went to the US. Then it was meeting the people in the Gulf, because I do feel in the Gulf it is a hybrid existence in a way that's much more fluid than I think people really appreciate as much, because there's nothing else. Yeah, I mean, it's very strange to even talk about it from an immigrant or religious lens, because this for me was very normal.
Yeah, but religion still, I mean, in Qatar, Islam is pretty ubiquitous, right? It's in the air, the call to prayer, the fasting. The life itself is organized around faith. So, sure, the way faith is practiced, some cultural practices may be different, but at the end of the day, you don't have to appease people or justify your religion or even hide or leave it at the door and not always talk about it. But then when you moved to New York, how different was that experience?
Now that was very different. That I think was that was a that I think that was the first time I had proper culture shock. It was very strange because I think even growing up, I do feel like I grew up with so much American culture. Even I think if you meet people in Qatar, it's always I didn't grow up watching Pakistani dramas or Pakistani movies. I watched American TV shows and American films, right? And I think I knew so much more about the US before I ever even went there. And I get so many culture references.
I mean, the vision of US that US exports, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it was the surreal thing for me going to the US was the idea of the American Muslim experience. That's something that I was not familiar with at all. Because I think I remember every now and then you would run across an American Muslim either in university or in school, or who had kind of come from the US, grew up in the US, and then moved to Qatar. And we would kind of joke that these Americans were all extremists because they were either fully fully hardcore, or fully anything goes.
On
And
the other end of
yeah.
the spectrum, right?
And it was always very confusing, where I was like, where's this coming from? I don't understand. For us, we didn't have the existential crises that I feel you get a lot when you're growing up in in the US. And I think when I went to the US, and I talked to a lot more American Muslims there, I think I actually have a lot more respect for the American Muslim community there now, especially the community in New York where I was. For the longest time, I think I really felt very lonely in my first year in New York because I barely knew anyone there. And I just was, even my grad school program was a much smaller program. It wasn't a big, massive campus building. And so I think meeting Muslims, or kind of meeting people who were similar to the people I grew up with, was very different. And everyone had very different ideas of what leisure time in Qatar, very different than leisure time in the US, right?
Give me an example, Salman.
I guess it's the fact that even the basic things, I would never really have to think much about oh, where am I gonna pray? If I needed to pray somewhere, right? For me, it was always oh, there's just a masjid down the block, it's gonna be fine. And I think I remember when my first Ramadan in the US, I kind of, I don't know, I felt this weird thing about even hiding like the fact that I was fasting, that like I would kind of like sneak away. Like, I would be like breaking my fast in the middle of the classroom. And then like I would just be like, oh, I have to go to the washroom. I'd just like walk out and like go break my fast and then come back. Or even if I had to go pray. And I don't know, like there was this like, we didn't have a prayer room in my university at the time. And I remember like I would have to like sneak out and like pray secretly in a classroom. And I would feel so self-conscious because it's not like anyone had said anything to me, but there was just a general sense that this feeling of like discomfort that I had never really felt before about being Muslim in a way that was like much more like you kind of almost feel this obligation that like anything you do is like representing all Muslims around like around the world, like in some way, because like oftentimes you're the only Muslim in the class or you're the only Muslim in the team, so you kind of become the representative of the whole community. And I think this is where I always like felt like I actually like would avoid any like conversations around religion at all, like in the US.
You've captured it so beautifully. That's exactly the essence of being a Muslim in the US. And what really pains me is second generation kids of immigrants, right? I'm an immigrant. I grew up in Pakistan. I say this often. Muslim identity was not the overarching identity for me growing up in Pakistan. I hardly thought about my Muslimness or that I was a Muslim because I was living in a Muslim majority country. It was not a big deal. I was more focused on being a woman and how do I break through that glass ceiling, right? It was a lot about that. But for Muslims, America is this place that puts you in this perpetual state of guilt for being a Muslim, for practicing a faith that's so integral to who you are. And it's an unspoken rule. You're right. Nobody says anything because a lot of times people will be like, oh, but nobody says anything. Yeah, they don't, but they make you uncomfortable to the point where you start doubting yourself and your religion and your identity. So you're absolutely right. Did it ever bother you, like to the point where it was almost like, did you feel that rage or anger?
I mean, yeah, I feel like it is interesting because I think even me growing up, like Muslim was never like an identity marker, right? And I think it wasn't like
Right, right.
like for me, my basic identity marker, like in Qatar, for example, like it was always like the question was like, oh, like what are you, like Pakistani, Indian? And it was like, yeah, I'm Pakistani. Like that was my identity marker. Whereas in the US, it's kind of like really like it was a weird thing to be like, oh, like I am technically like yeah, I am a Muslim from Pakistan who is in America now, so you kind of are part of the Muslim community. And honestly, I think in the beginning I kind of felt really self-conscious about it, but I think over time, especially like when I spend more time with the Islamic Center of NYU and Imam Khalid Latif and the community of like, when I started to kind of meet more Muslims who had grown up in the US and were second generation immigrants or like children of immigrants, or I actually was very surprised to see like, because I think I had this perception in my mind of like these like, oh, people will either be of like extremists in one category or the other. And I think when I actually started spending more time in these communities, I actually felt there is something beautiful that happens in a place like the US, that you go beyond your like labels of nationality in the same way, and you kind of become part of this collective broader group of Muslims. Actually, it's very strange because like I actually never felt that connected to the mosque or like as a space of community or like a space of actual learning. The mosque was always like you go pray and you leave, you go pray and you leave, that's it. Until I was in the US and you kind of feel so isolated all of the time that when you then go to a space like the Islamic Center of NYU, and a space that was so welcoming, even for people like me who barely knew anyone in New York at the time. I remember that mom would always be like, "Hey, look around you, say salam to the next guy sitting right next to you." And like you don't know where this person is from, or whether this is the first time that they're in New York, or this is their first time in the masjid, or it's the first time like being around Muslims. So just say salam. And I just realized like that was something that I just would feel like a desire to go to the mosque or go to these community spaces in a way that I never really felt growing up in a Muslim country, surprisingly enough.
As I'm listening to you, I'm nodding because that conviction, that sense of community, I did not have that in Pakistan because I was not so fixated on one identity marker. But I want to ask you this because I've struggled with this at times when my faith went quiet on me from within, right? It's almost as if you're practicing a habit or a ritual. Sure, I will pray, but it doesn't move me. It doesn't have the same conviction. And then there are times when I really connect with who I am more in a spiritual way.
Stitch Fix. Shopping is hard. Let's talk about it.
I don't have time to shop for clothes.
I have to buy everything in 3 sizes to find one that fits. They know me at the post office. Workout wear is my only wear.
Stitch Fix makes shopping easy. Just show your size, style, and budget, and your stylist sends personalized looks right to your door. No subscription required, plus free shipping and returns.
Oh, wow, that was easy.
Stitch Fix, online personal styling for everyone. Take your style quiz today at stitchfix.com.
Talking about Rumi, I think there is so much spirituality within Islam that we don't think about because we focus so much on rituals. Have there been moments where your faith has gone quiet on you completely and you're like, okay, now it's all just motions and rituals?
Yeah, I mean, I had a friend who once described it like, I guess your relationship with your faith is never like a flat line. It's always either going up or it's either like going down, right? I remember even like this guy came and he was giving this talk. I remember like it's something that has stuck with me around this point, which is like he just came in and he was like, like I think if you're approaching religion almost as this high that you get in prayer, right? And if you're always chasing that high, then it's bound to like eventually disappoint you because you will build a tolerance, right? Or you will build like, and I think a lot of it is actually like spending. When I've been in those situations, I feel like I felt that a lot in the US, that like the most like feeling so isolated, like I was living alone. I didn't know that many people there, and having never really been in a situation where I would have to like explain things to people. And I think I kind of felt really bad about it. One of my colleagues would ask like, what are you doing? Like, where are you going? Right. And because they would be like, why is this guy doing some suspicious stuff? I felt like I should be very like confident in my deen and like in my faith to just be like, yeah, I'm going to go pray.
But you don't. You can't be when everybody around you is doubting you or creating a narrative that makes you doubt everything about your religion.
This is also one of the reasons why like I feel like we wanted to, like, honestly, one of the reasons I wanted to do this show was to have a space to be able to process these questions and to process these feelings with other Muslims and kind of do it in a way where, like, honestly, there's like a nice structure to narrative.
That's true.
I'm not even talking about the idea of plot, right? I think there's a nice structure to how the process of like building a story is very similar to doing research for an academic project, because I think you actually have to spend a lot of time in the story yourself and really reckoning with these questions and spending time writing out, talking to other people, and it was like a perfect opportunity to ask people questions that you have yourself that you can just go to other people and magically they sometimes have answers, sometimes they force you to think of more questions. And I think living in this space of these conversations and having the ability to talk to other people about it and to talk to like people who've thought about it much more deeply than I ever will, right? And this is where like I feel the need to read and spend a lot more time writing and researching and really spending time with my own thoughts rather than go into this nihilistic doom hole. And I think in general, like I'm more always predisposed to like not being nihilistic.
Have those questions, has that inquiry led you to an uncomfortable place about your religion? Have you been disappointed in Islam through this process?
Yeah, I wouldn't say so. I mean, I think it's very much more like, honestly, even before the show, I think for me was more helpful was actually being in the classroom in the university space. Because I feel like that's a space where like you kind of realize like this is also what we were talking about in the Rumi story was in you want to ideally find really clean cut answers to everything in a way that makes you feel nice about yourself. A lot of times this is the challenge that a lot of Muslim jurists had like over the course of Islamic law, where it wasn't always the question of like how do I get to the answer that makes me feel the best at the end of the day. It was always these challenging questions of like how do I grapple with this thing that is either something in my life or in my faith. And it's always this grappling that gets us to deeper truths. And I think that's the idea behind seeing like, how do I grapple with these things that are making me uncomfortable and not actually just directly putting a label on them. And I think that's where a lot of us fall into these traps, especially when we're younger. Like it's so much easier to just be like, okay, like now I don't like this, so now I'm not going to do any of it. So I'm just going to kind of do all of it.
We don't know how to sit with contradiction, accept it, right? Because once we learn to see contradictions in what we uncover and how it impacts us, it's easier to live with that dichotomy in a way, right? If religion itself, if somebody were to take that away from you, not the cultural part, not the community part, the faith itself, what part of you would go with it? How much of Salman will you lose in that?
I mean, it's a hard thing to. I don't really know the answer to that question because I've not been in that situation. And I think for me, it's very much like I think Islam has always been a part of my life growing up. It's like asking me like what I would be like without my parents, or like if my parents didn't raise me and someone else raised me. I don't know. I mean, funnily enough, I often think about this movie, this animated children's movie I saw from Pixar called Inside Out. And there's this idea in that movie where it's like kids have these personality islands that they build over time. And those personality islands, like as they grow and they evolve over the years, they either those islands become bigger or they become smaller, and some of them just disappears. And those are all just little bubbles of like, what are the things that form who you are today? And I think I kind of see religion in a similar way, where it's almost like it's this kind of overarching things that's governing your like little personality islands, and you don't really know, like you could be someone, you could kind of just say today and just I'm just not going to do anything.
Right.
There's still going to be some part of you that was like raised and like grew up with and kind of had this personal spiritual connection that kind of retains itself. That is the thing that you're always in conflict with over, like, or at least I've been throughout my life of like trying to navigate where I'm falling in this like jigsaw, and what are my current personality islands right now.
I ask this question because when I think of it, it's humility and being grounded, right? I feel like Islam gives me that because it also anchors me around I'm not in control of everything. And since I'm not in control of everything, I can't change everything. And that makes me human in a way. So it's the humanity that I feel I will lose if I lost my faith. In the end, Salman, if you were to define the United States of America in the context of how it treats its Muslim community, how would you do that?
With the caveat that I mostly spend my time in New York, I actually felt that.
Sure, you saw the better part of the US. I get that, but still.
Yeah. I feel like it's a very challenging space for Muslims and for, I guess, for any new community going to the US in general. It is a very challenging space, whether you're an immigrant, whether you're Muslim, whether you're coming in from different places. But I do feel like the US is a place that really forces you to reckon with who you are in a way that I haven't seen anywhere else. That might just be the fact that like I went in my late 20s and was like alone and like didn't know that many people there. Like you might have had a similar experience elsewhere, but I think what I have noticed in the US, and especially with like the newer generations, like the second generation of Muslims who are kind of going beyond that binary of like either I'm gonna reject Islam or I'm gonna fully become like I'm kind of gonna create an American version of Islam and a more indigenized like American version of Islam, which again has existed in various capacities for hundreds of years in the US as well, right?
Exactly. That's what I was going to say, that yes, Islam is also indigenous to America. And people don't realize that. People see Muslims as newcomers. They're not.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I've noticed a lot is I think there's been a lot of conversations within the Muslim communities around kind of like especially South Asian Muslim communities around actually engaging with the Black Muslim communities that have existed there for a lot longer. Like I think I think Syrian, even when I was doing this halal meat story, I think we talked to I think one of the first major halal meat butcheries that were founded in the US was founded by this like Syrian Lebanese family that has been in the US for more than 100 years.
Yeah.
I think those are the kinds of things that I think us coming from like South Asian backgrounds or like coming from different Arab backgrounds, there's a tendency to see American Muslims as only the Muslims around you or the Muslims from your community. But I think that's the thing that I've really liked about the US was that the mosque would become the space where you're actually like actively meeting and seeing all these like different cultures of Muslim communities in the US, kind of having their variations on Islamic practice over the course of like, even in a place like Queens, every masjid you go to has its own like internal drama that I would be seeing. And
and to your point, I think the perception of Muslims being newcomers is also tied to how Black Muslim identity has been erased in conversations for so long by Muslim communities in the US. So that's another important layer that people don't talk about. This has been a phenomenal conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Where can people find More Muslim?
You can find More Muslim on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get podcasts. We are also on moremuslim.org and on Instagram on More Muslim Show.
Where can people find you?
I mean, I'm on Twitter at Salman Ahad K. I'm on Instagram at Salman Ahad Khan. My colleague on a social media team made sure I opened up my page, and I haven't been that active on social media, so just trying out to see what that looks like now.
Thank you, Salman. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time.
Stay safe in Qatar, and hopefully peace will prevail. We are keeping our fingers crossed.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You know, when Salman talked about his experience as a Muslim in New York, I don't know, I was getting very emotional. I was teary-eyed, not because it was surprising to me, but because it was so real. And for Salman, there's a choice. He is in Qatar. He doesn't have to live through that experience all the time. But a lot of Muslims, immigrants, non-immigrants, people who've had generations in the US, especially Black Muslims who've lived here for hundreds of years, we all face that. And I think all of us have a responsibility to see why Muslim community is made to feel so uncomfortable about who they are. What is wrong with us as a society that we have alienated this one group to the extent where we're really affecting them psychologically. And as a Muslim, I can tell you, yes, it happens. The code switching, the fear, the dissonance between who we are and how we are expected to show up, it takes a toll on all of us. This episode was written and produced by me, Saadia Khan. The editorial review is done by Shay Yu. Our sound designer and editor is Lou Raskin. Immigrantly's theme music is done by Simon Hutchinson. Other music by Epidemic Sound. Come back next week when we have another great episode for all of you. Until then, take care and be kind to others.